Yeah, I'm Dave Errickson. I'm at Cranfield University as a lecturer in forensic science. But my interest in 3D imaging, and particularly 3D imaging orientated towards the court, has been probably with me for the last 10 years. And I don't think I would be stretching the boat or whatever terminology you would like to use when I say I was probably one of the first or around the time when we were first starting to use 3D evidence or think about using 3D evidence within the court. And my first ever scanner that I used was a FARO laser scanner. It was a FARO Edge. I did have a lunchbox as well, but yeah, the FARO Edge was good. And so what I'm really interested in is the perception of people, the way that we can present new forms of evidence in the courtroom. How easy is it for us to understand newer types of evidence or other types of evidence in 3D or in 3D printed form? And does it improve like our technical understanding of jargon? Does it improve our understanding of what the expert witness is presenting? Does it help us understand spatially the relationship between certain objects? And so I'm going to come a little bit from a UK perspective, obviously being based in the United Kingdom. But I think this presentation is a little bit pertinent to us all around the world. And I am a big believer in collaboration and sharing data and sharing information as long as it's within that kind of ethical framework to do so. And I won't mention GDPR. So I do, if anybody does want to get in touch as well, feel free to kind of reach out as well. And my last thing I want to say before I start is actually I'm not doing this alone. I know that I'm obviously giving this presentation, but I have two other researchers who I work with very much so. Rachel Carew at University College London and Dr. Amber Collings, who's up at Teesside University as well. So I need to thank them right now before I begin. So thank you, both of you. So in terms of kind of imaging, I think 3D laser scanning, 3D structured light scanning, as well as photogrammetry is now well integrated within a variety of disciplines across the world. You don't need me to tell you that 3D kind of modeling and 3D scanning has been around for a long time, specifically placed within the engineering studies and medicine. But that since now has kind of like filters its way through to forensic science and probably has been within forensic science for easily the last 10 years. So 3D scanning in terms of the data capture, I think has been around for a long time. But 3D printing, on the other hand, is this kind of very new topic where we're only really starting to think about it because since the patents ran out on 3D printing, it's become more accessible. And what we're seeing now is that it's being integrated into forensic science, but there's some considerations that we really need to kind of think about before we actually keep using it and keep moving forward. Believe me, I want it to move forward as much as the next person, but there are some little elements that we need to consider, and I'm going to go through them in a moment. And the advantages for using 3D imaging and 3D printing is vast, and I'm going to touch upon these advantages in a moment and show some examples of 3D printing and 3D scanning. But because there's so much out there at the moment with regards to 3D scanning and 3D printing, the thing that I find most surprising is that the case studies that are out there at the moment within the kind of scientific literature are very limited. And because of that, you would think that 3D printing and 3D scanning isn't being used in the UK courts, but it actually is. And I find this very surprising. I do have, again, another couple of examples to show you, and I'm hoping that this will kind of bring forward this awareness that we need to start publishing our case studies and we need to share our data amongst ourselves. But also we need to address the current use of 3D imaging in the court because there may be some unknown biases, especially with regards to kind of persuading people to say guilty or not guilty based on what we're saying or what we're showing them. And if we don't consider these now, it's going to hinder the future progression of the application of 3D imaging to the court. So we need to start thinking about standards. We need to start thinking about good practice. We need to start thinking about the effects of this material on the jury, the judge, and the people in the courtroom. And so, like I said, from a UK point of view, but the fact that these three bold-headed words, clear, relevant, reliable, doesn't just apply to the UK courts, it applies to everywhere across the world. Evidence should be clear, evidence should be relevant, and evidence should be reliable. I think for the most part, the clear and relevant section, or when we start to think about 3D imaging, we're covered there. And actually using 3D imaging in the court, I think, we're able to do that because of the rules that are stated. So in the criminal procedure rules within England and Wales, for example, an expert witness can take exhibits such as 3D prints into the court to support their testimony, but they must adhere to several criteria. And for the most part, those two criteria are the information or the evidence being relevant and the information or the evidence being reliable. And yeah, clear evidence should always be clear. And I think I don't need to kind of delve into that, but the relevance and the reliability is really where we need to start addressing. And I'll come back to this in just a moment, because there are so many advantages. And I've put an example of two papers on this slide here for people to be able to delve into. And if you can't access the second paper, the overview of 3D printing, please get in touch. I'm happy to share that with you. In these papers, especially the one by Komar and colleagues, they outline very early on in kind of the 3D printing application to forensic science, the advantages of 3D printing to forensic science. It's really at a time when nobody's kind of thinking about it or applying it publicly that we're all aware of. And so the basis of our article that came out earlier this year was kind of formed upon the back of that 3D laser scanning article by Komar and colleagues. But if we have 3D scans or if we have 3D prints, these replications allow us to retain data long after a scene has disappeared or a scene has changed. So we think about road traffic accidents, for example, and I'm sure there's been a presentation or two on that, or there will be coming up. But it's a rapid form of documenting the scene in 3D, which can then be preserved once the road's back open again. And so we have that data that we can always go back to. But once that scene is open, physically we can't, because it's changed. And the example that I've got on this screen here in the bottom right hand corner, this was taken with a FARO focus terrestrial laser scanner. It's not the best 3D print in the world, I'll admit, but what you can see here is a scene with a body in the scene. You've got the gun where the arrow is pointing to, and you can see the objects as well within the scene, such as the sofa, the TV stand with the lampshade stood on top of it. And spatially for the courtroom, this is really beneficial to be able to show that relationship between objects and people and evidence. And I mean, we used to think about the dollhouse when we used to go to court. We used to provide, create this dollhouse of the scene, and then we could be able to show the jurors and the judge what the relationship was between objects within the scene by using this kind of manufactured dollhouse. But now we don't even need to do that. Now we can just 3D scan the scene and create the dollhouse ourselves, but it's all to scale and it's all accurate. We don't have to worry about where the table is going to go, because when we print it, that is where the table was. And we can scale this up and down depending on the necessity. And the good thing is, I think today, is that there are many low-cost methods available for creating 3D printed models from that 3D data that we've captured. And then finally, the biggest plus for me is that it's non-invasive, it's non-contact. We can do it first, and then we can do all of the traditional techniques that we would normally do at a crime scene anyway. And so we're not losing anything apart from a small amount of time. So to scan this room here, it probably took us 10 minutes. I think 3 scans in total, just to make sure that we captured all elements of the scene. But yeah, less than 10 minutes is not really adding anything to that kind of judicial evidential process. And so these are some of the examples that I wanted to just kind of show you, because like I said, 3D imaging actually is being used in the UK courts right now, but we don't we're not aware of it because a lot of the casework is not published. And so the example on the left again is a rough example of that kind of 3D scene that I showed you a moment ago with the gun highlighted. This is being created by the terrestrial laser scanner, but then built up using 3D printing. The image on the right was a case of dismemberment where they found two segments of bone. This is in the article by Bayer and colleagues in 2017, and I'll show you the reference for that on the last slide. And what they were able to do is 3D print both individual parts, which were found one away from the other, and physically reconstruct that together to show that these pieces of the humerus were actually from the same humerus. I mean, that's amazing. And then the one in the middle here is an example from Southwest Forensics about can we fit the body and transport the body in a suitcase. And so actually physically 3D printing the suitcase and the body, and then showing that actually the body does fit in the suitcase or doesn't fit in the suitcase to refute our substance. It's just really interesting how demonstrating evidence in the courtroom rather than saying, well, person and together we can actually physically show it. But if we actually have the 3D data of the actual suitcase and the actual body, it's more accurate than anything else. It's more accurate than me getting a suitcase. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention about the limitations of this 3D imaging process. And the biggest thing for me here is that we are using them in the court, and I get that, but we don't have the validation in place at the moment. We don't have the underlying data or the underpinning data to show that it's accurate. There are a lot of studies out there that are demonstrating, okay, 3D imaging is accurate, we've done these measurements on it, and 3D printing is, but it's not orientated towards the courtroom. There are some inaccuracies as well with scanning and printing, especially depending on the parameters that we use in that post-processing kind of method. You know, smoothing parameters are obviously going to mask data or change data. It's going to smooth areas of the model, which is no longer an accurate representation of the model. So how much smoothing can we apply to a model before the model is no longer an accurate model for demonstration within the court? And then, of course, when we're 3D printing, sometimes there are things like struts, which we have to remove, which can create imperfections on the model. And the biggest thing for me is bias. So if I show you this 3D printed model, and if I tell you that the scenario associated with this model, is that more effective of then the jury then turning around and saying, okay, that individual must be guilty? Where if I show a 3D picture or a 2D picture, a traditional photograph, I suppose, is that less pertinent to someone persuading someone to say guilty against not guilty? So then can we actually start to change the jurors' opinions based on the information that we're showing them? And if we can, then it's not going to be long until 3D printing is kicked out of the courts. So should we care? Do we care? Well, we do care, but we just need to make sure that it's reliable. Okay, and I can't emphasize that enough. Let me show you an example. So this is a case study that I undertook just to kind of test this bias understanding within the court, the presentation of information within the court. This is in my paper, The Effect of Different Imaging Techniques for the Visual Evidence in Court and Jury Comprehension. And basically what we did is we got 91 unfortunately they all didn't sign the approval form, and we created them into little different pools of juries, so with different sets of 12 individuals. Then what we did is we had an audio script. The case was centered around two individuals who were leaving a bar. One individual was either pushed and hit their head on the concrete and fractured their skull, or they slipped and fractured their skull. Now, it was neither one or the other, and it was for the jury to decide whether that individual was pushed or whether that individual fell. Every set of jurors listened to exactly the same script. Nothing changed. They were in the same environment within an actual court setting. so nothing changed there. The only thing that changed between individual pools was the visual evidence that they saw. And I think I used a FARO Edge originally to record this 3D model, but what the three different types of visual mediums that the juries saw was either a photograph on the left, a scan, a 3D model in the middle, and a 3D printed model on the right. They didn't see every single one, they only saw one. And then afterwards, what we did is we captured that data using a questionnaire anonymously. But the results are quite interesting, because what we see here when on the first table is that 3D imaging, and in particular 3D printed models, are actually improving the understanding of technical jargon and the clarity of the expert witness within the court. So we have a few people didn't understand the language using photography. Digitizations was about the same, but the higher number of people who understood it, or the higher pool of people that looked at 3D digitizations and 3D printed models, was about 10 or 15 people higher than photographic imaging. But then yet still 3D printed models, 31 people understood the language in comparison to 2. So that's a significant increase in comparison to photographic imaging. And actually, when we asked the question, do you understand technical jargon or technical language if the image is more clearer? That was obviously a yes, of course we do. And I mean, that was asking a silly question really, but the most interesting thing here, I think, is that the 3D printed models is enhancing the understanding of jurors. But we also asked them whether we thought the individual, the defendant, was guilty or not guilty based upon the mediums that they were looking at. And photographic imaging was an 18:6 split, which was exactly or the same kind of ratio as the 3D digitization model, 26:8. However, the individuals or the jurors that saw the 3D printed models were unfortunately then split. So they were at 18:15 not guilty to guilty ratio. And so I wonder, based upon the 3D printed evidence that we were showing them and letting them handle it and visualize, whether we're actually becoming more biased towards the guilty side of things, that maybe they're not listening to the expert witness because they're too busy focused on a physical object in front of them, where they can make up their own scenarios, or they can see how damaging that is and compare it to their own skills. And so this is really an area that we need to explore even further. And I can't take all the credit for this because there are other publications out there that focus on this. Blau et al. 2018, Ampinozzi et al. 2012 is really what kind of kicked this kind of study off for me. And so I recommend having a look at those publications as well. But the future is bright. So in November this year, literally probably about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, the Forensic Capability Network within the UK now have created this working group. And this is open for anybody who's interested in joining. So if anybody is focused in the UK and would like to join, what we're trying to do is actually address these issues with regards to standardization, working practice, and such for the courtroom. And so some of the questions that we're trying to address at the moment is, how are these prints being made? Who's making these prints? Who's producing them for courtroom defense, and who should be defending these prints in the courtroom? Should it be an anthropologist? Should it be a forensic scientist? Should it be an engineer? And then what do we do with the data afterwards? Do we keep the data? Do we have to get rid of that data? Sometimes if we're scanning human remains, for example, that's personal data. And so we might have to dispose of that in the same way as we would in kind of a forensic autopsy or analysis of a body. So this is good. This is great because we're moving forward in the 3D realm, and we're not just addressing 3D printing here, even though the working group says it's 3D printing. We're also looking at the data capture because really that contextualizes the 3D printing side of things. But I'm glad to say that we are starting to address questions like bias and subjectivity and such in the court. So just to kind of conclude, and there's a couple of references on this slide, that let's start working together. Let's start syncing our practice together, whether you're in the UK or Australia or America or Europe or anywhere. we need to start thinking about how we're creating these models, what we're doing to create these models, and how we're presenting them, but also addressing these underpinning questions. Are we biasing people? Are we persuading people to commit to a guilty, not guilty verdict based upon the evidence? Because ultimately, if that evidence is persuading someone to say guilty, but ultimately that individual isn't guilty, then that is unlawful. And again, like I said, if we don't start thinking about these questions, then we're going to stop the progression of 3D imaging in policing and the courts. So finally, if anybody wants to reach out, please do. And thank you all for listening. Thank you, Sunita, for inviting me today. And thank you for Ryan for hosting. And I'll open up for some questions.
Wow, thank you, David. That's a very insightful research and some results you have there. So let's just check in quickly with the audience. So we have a few questions again. And again, as a reminder to our audience, if you have questions, feel free to ask them in your local language, whether that's English, Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, Portuguese, German, French, or Italian. Okay, we have a team of people here looking out for those questions in any languages, and we will try to ask as many of them live as possible. And again, if we cannot get to all of them in time, just know that we will be following up after this event via email to answer your questions.
I apologize.
Yes,
sorry,
yes,
Ryan.
David.
I was going to apologize because I've just noticed that my video might have been cutting in and out. So I apologize if that created any issues.
No problem. It was fine most of the time. Yeah. All right. With regards to that UK court system that you have there, can you maybe share a little bit more about that, and what do you see as far as using this type of 3D data in that at the moment?
Yeah, so we started a new research project, which I haven't mentioned in this presentation, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to inform the wider forensic community about the cases that we are using currently in the courts. And so we started reaching out to police forces around the UK, Southwest Forensics, the Metropolitan Police, Wiltshire Police and such, and so on. And what it actually turned out is that people are using these 3D prints in the court at the moment. And I think that's great. I think the use of 3D printing certainly helps the jury to understand spatial relationships between particular objects. But again, we just need to address these underpinning issues, because at the moment, 3D imaging in the court is vulnerable to bad practice. If we turn around and we say, if I defended in the courtroom 3D imaging, or if I was a prosecutor and I was against the expert witness, I'd easily be able to dismantle their argument, because at the moment there is no standards in the UK for using it. And so we just need to address that, because it'll only take one case to take down all 3D imaging. We'll be back at the start again. And so if we can just develop some guidelines, then we're secure, we're safe, we're protecting ourselves, if that makes sense. But I think FARO are doing great things as well. And Marcus Rowe, I know he's been absolutely great in terms of working with us. And I know they're thinking about white papers and creating these good practices. So I think the future's bright.
Yes, thanks, David. How about considering as well going to the next level where, as you know, there's also virtual reality now, and it's also been used in some of the courts already. So what are your thoughts about that in terms of, your UK setting?
Yeah, so I actually don't think virtual reality or too much virtual reality has been used in the UK courts. There probably is a few case studies that we could rely on, but again, it's immersive. So it's emotional. And so can we actually, again, persuade the jury based upon what we're seeing? So again, just the same kind of questions. And that's going to be the same, holograms might be next, right? So what's the situation with holograms? Or the Star Trek, beam me up Scotty type material. It's like, yes. it's just scientific rigor. It's just making sure that what we're doing is correct. or at least supported by information or data. That's all. But that's a good question. David.